Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first Digital Leadership Series event of 2022. I couldn't be more delighted that all of you are here with us today once again. I was looking at the registration list before I signed on today, and it's just so nice to see so many of our old friends, students, alumni, all attending today, and of course, members of our community. So welcome to one and all, and a belated Happy New Year to all of you. Before I get started, I wanted to acknowledge our sponsors, KPMG and Kalpana Ramakrishnan in particular, who has been supporting our center and serves on our advisory board, and the Beal Family Foundation. I believe Don Beal himself may be attending tonight, so thank you, Don. Thank you, Kalpana. You make it possible for our audience to attend at no cost, and we remain very grateful for your support of what you do for the university and the center. Thank you again. With that, let me introduce some of the themes for today. We're featuring Martin Ford, who is a best-selling author. He wrote the book Rise of the Robots, which won the McKinsey Award and the Financial Times / McKinsey Best Business Book of the Year a few years ago. And now he's followed up with a book called Rule of the Robots, which of course reflects the fact that artificial intelligence has become so much important in the few short years since his previous book. One of the things I did want to mention was one of the other things he wrote in between was this book called Architects of Intelligence, which I actually have all three of these books. And it's a fascinating book because he interviewed the movers and shakers of artificial intelligence, the people who are actually building the algorithms, building the systems. And so Martin has perhaps one of the best perches in Silicon Valley to analyze sort of what is happening in the artificial intelligence industry, what the impacts are for good and for unfortunately sometimes not so good, and can give us a view of sort of where this is all going. So the book is Rule of the Robots: How Artificial Intelligence Will Transform Everything. So welcome, Martin. But before I turn it over to you, just one housekeeping note, which is we will be taking questions in the Q&A section. The chat section is closed. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us this evening, Martin. We're just really, really delighted to host you and really looking forward to what you have to share with us tonight. Take it away.
Thank you. It's really great to be here, and thank you all for coming. I have been focused on the implications of artificial intelligence and robotics for well over a decade now. I've written a total of 4 books on this subject, and having really studied this, I've really come around to the view that we are very likely on the verge of a very significant disruption. And I think it's a disruption that potentially is going to be transformative on the scale of a new industrial revolution. I think we're beginning to see the early stages of this now. I also think that clearly this is a disruption that's going to have 2 sides to it. It is going to bring enormous benefits really to all of humanity. It's going to, I think, give a major boost to science, to medicine, to scientific innovation. It's going to help us solve some of the biggest problems that we face. But at the same time, the rise of AI is going to bring with it some real risks and some real dangers that we're going to have to be very much aware of. So I think our task going forward is going to be to embrace this technology, but at the same time be very much aware of the dangers that comes with it and adapt to those. So what I want to do is just briefly go over some of the main topics in my recent book, Rule of the Robots, and then we will move to a discussion, and we can perhaps talk about things in more detail. So first of all, what is artificial intelligence really all about? And I would argue that the thing that makes it unique is that we are really, for the first time, bringing cognitive capability to machines. We're building machines that in a limited sense, at least, can think. And in a practical sense, AI today is really all about machine learning. And essentially what that means is building smart algorithms that can churn through massive amounts of data, and based on that data, they can learn, they can figure out how to do things, how to predict things, how to gain insights. And all of this is really what is leading to the revolution all around us. And to some extent, it really represents kind of a paradigm shift in our approach to software. You know, previously software has been something that programmers, you know, software developers have had to instruct basically step by step, you know, and teaching an algorithm what to do. Machine learning essentially turns that on its head, and instead you unleash an algorithm, a learning algorithm with lots of data, and it by itself figures out what to do or how to solve various problems. So it's in a sense migrating the intelligence, the direction from the programmer to the software itself. And I think that this is really an important shift in the way we approach things. The second thing that I think is critical, and this is something that I really emphasize throughout the book, it's really a main theme of Rule of the Robots, is that I think artificial intelligence is becoming a genuine a general purpose technology, a systemic technology. In some ways, it's evolving into something that is really like a utility, almost like electricity, in the sense that it is becoming ubiquitous. It's going to be everywhere. It's going to touch virtually every aspect of our lives, every sector of the economy, every industry, literally every business, every organization. All of these are going to be massively impacted by artificial intelligence, and it is rapidly becoming a resource that's, I think, going to be, you know, not just everywhere, but is also indispensable in the same way that electricity is. You can imagine what your life would be like, even for just one day, if you didn't have access to electricity. I mean, how many things in your daily life relies on access to electricity? And the same is eventually becoming true of artificial intelligence. So it's got a massive, very broad-based impact. Now, one of the things that's really driving this evolution of AI into a utility is the fact that it's been incorporated into cloud computing. I mean, cloud computing is itself becoming ubiquitous. Virtually every organization of any size utilizes cloud computing resources, primarily from one of the three major providers. And AI is being built directly into cloud computing offerings from these large, extremely, you know, influential, deep-pocketed organizations like Google and Amazon and Microsoft. And as it turns out, of course, it's no coincidence that these large companies are also, of course, the leading innovators in AI. You know, these are, you know, companies like Google and Microsoft are the companies that are, for the most part, the driving forces in you know, causing AI to advance. The key technology that's really underlying the revolution that we see all around us is deep learning, or deep neural networks. This is the use of artificial neural networks in order to, you know, produce machine learning systems. And this is an idea that has actually been around for a long time. The first neural networks were developed in the late 1940s, but roughly over the last decade or so, we've seen a real revolution in this technology. It's probably fair to say that the last decade has been probably the most consequential period in the field of artificial intelligence in terms of the explosion of real world applications that we've seen. And we are literally seeing things all around us that just a short time ago we would have considered to be science fiction, really. We see, for example, Google's language translation that is able to translate between hundreds of different languages and give you a genuinely workable translation of virtually any text almost instantly. And that's really a major shift from before, when you would have had to hire someone for even the smallest amount of text. You would have had to go out and hire someone to translate that text. Deep learning is what is making self-driving cars possible. Companies like Tesla utilize this technology in order to build their technology. It's what makes possible Amazon Alexa, where we're beginning to see the possibility to have at least rudimentary conversations with machines like the Amazon Echo. So all of these things that we're seeing explode around us are really being driven by this single, very powerful technology. And this revolution was really brought about by a few things that have happened, especially starting around the year 2012. That was the real inflection point. The first thing that happened is that computers simply got dramatically faster. As a result of the accumulated impact of Moore's law, computers finally got to the point where it was feasible to leverage this neural network technology in a way that would produce practical results. But the second, and maybe the most important thing, is that we now have available to us just enormous, incomprehensible amounts of data. And all of this data, which is now available, is really becoming kind of the feedstock to these smart algorithms. And it's the algorithms running on the fast computers together with all of this massive amounts of data that is finally producing these major breakthroughs. Deep learning has also kind of revolutionized the hardware industry. We've seen, in particular, the growth of companies like NVIDIA, which started out as building chips used in graphic processors, but it was discovered that these chips were also extremely useful in making deep learning applications faster. And so we've seen just an explosion in the hardware side of things in terms of the design of chips that are specifically designed to accelerate deep learning applications. And that's also been one of the most important drivers of the progress that we've seen. So we already see these amazing things all around us, primarily as the result of these recent breakthroughs in deep learning. But it's also very clear that we are really only in the infancy of this revolution. And you can see that, I think, most aptly by comparing the capabilities of many of these systems to the ultimate objective, which is to build an AI system which comes much closer to simulating what the human brain can do. You look at the kinds of problems that human beings are able to solve and compare that to what deep learning can do, and it's obvious that we have a long way to go. But that is nonetheless a very important research initiative. There are many people working on how can we take these deep learning systems, which are primarily good at doing very narrow specific things, and how can we evolve those so that they become more general in terms of their application and get closer and closer to what we would consider to be genuine human level intelligence, where you have the ability to reason like a human being, to have things like common sense, for example, to transfer knowledge from one area to another area. These are all things that human beings are uniquely adept at doing. And these are all areas that are under, very significant research in terms of what's happening throughout the field. So I think one of the most interesting chapters in Rule of the Robots is the chapter where I really break this down and talk about the different approaches being taken and the companies doing it and the individuals doing it and so forth. And that is in part based on the interviews I did with some of the top people in the field. So to me, that was probably the most interesting and enjoyable part of writing Rule of the Robots. And I think that is a truly fascinating subject, how this field is going to evolve and how soon we might eventually get to a true thinking machine, something that is going to approach human level intelligence. But for the foreseeable future, this is a technology that is primarily going to be highly specific, and it's going to be used to increasingly solve a range of practical problems. Now, one of the most exciting, maybe the most exciting applications of artificial intelligence that I think has so far emerged has been the announcement of a system called AlphaFold, which was created by the company DeepMind, which is a division of Alphabet, Google's parent, which is based in London. Now, DeepMind is the company you've probably heard of, that they created, for example, AlphaGo, which the system that was able to prevail at the game of Go. And you'll remember that back in 2016, AlphaGo was able to defeat the best Go player in the world. And since then, they've released a number of other game playing systems like AlphaZero that was able to prevail not only at Go, but also at chess and other games. So they've been, extraordinarily adept at utilizing the deep learning and the techniques at the very frontier of the field to win, to beat basically any human competitor at these games. But What AlphaFold represents is, I think, really the first time where this technology has been purposed into something that is really real, where it is really being leveraged, not to win a game, but to make a revolution, which is going to have an impact in science. So what AlphaFold is about discovering the three-dimensional structure or shape of protein molecules. Now, protein molecules are fabricated in our cells, and we understand in a fairly straightforward way how they're put together. Protein molecules are basically a chain of smaller molecules called amino acids. And this sequence that makes up this chain is determined by the DNA in our cells. And that's all fairly straightforward. But what happens is that when these chains are constructed, when the amino acids are put together in the cell, within a tiny fraction of a second after this molecule, sometimes huge molecule, is fabricated, it automatically folds up into a very complex shape. And you see one example of that on the slide here. Now, it is that shape that actually determines the function, the chemical function of the molecule within our cells. And it's also what determines, for example, how these molecules interact with drugs and so forth. I mean, protein molecules are incredibly important. They are really the fabric of life. They make up the structures in our bodies, muscles and so forth. But also, just as importantly, they are the molecules that perform functions within our body. So all enzymes, for example, are proteins. So to understand the shape of these molecules is just of enormous importance. And yet it has been very, very difficult to solve this problem, to figure out how do you get from a sequence of amino acids to a specific shape. And there are some very expensive and time-consuming laboratory techniques that can do this, but scientists for 50 years have tried to figure out how to analyze the genetic sequence or the sequence of amino acids and figure out the shape. And after a 50-year quest, AlphaFold essentially was able to solve that problem. We now have a system that can do that very easily. And as a result of that, DeepMind is making a catalog of all of the proteins that are important to the human body. And this is just going to be an enormously important resource in medicine, in biotechnology, and so forth. So this is just one example of how advances at the frontiers of artificial intelligence have led to a truly revolutionary breakthrough, something that is very likely to impact all of our lives in a relatively near future. Now, one of the areas that I've really focused on a lot is the potential impact of artificial intelligence and robotics on jobs and on the job market in general. And a lot of this is centered on robots, which have really seen revolutionary advances over the last decade or so. What you see here is an illustration showing what the robots that are used in Amazon warehouses look like. And as you can see, they look something like big hockey pucks. And what these robots do is that they essentially move around the warehouse at relatively high speeds, and they carry shelves containing inventory. Now, before the advent of these robots, a warehouse like the ones used at Amazon would have instead had rows and rows of these huge stationary shelves, and the workers would have run around between these shelves, and they would have been doing one of two things. Either they would have been taking new inventory, arriving in the warehouse and putting it into a specific place on the shelf, or they would have been going to the shelf, often climbing up high ladders and so forth, in order to grab an item from the shelf in order to fulfill an order to send to a customer. Now, the advent of these robots have actually turned that around. And what happens is that instead of running around to all these shelves, the workers stand stationary in one place. And you see an example of this guy here. And it's the shelves that move around to the workers. And so you see this gentleman here reaching into a shelf, and he's either placing an item or retrieving an item to fulfill an order. So this is really cut down on the wear and tear on workers, who now get to stand in one place, and automated the movement of the shelves. But the important thing to note is that these Amazon warehouses and other warehouses from other companies have thousands and thousands of these robots, but they also still have thousands of workers. And the workers and the robots work together. And the reason that we still have all these workers there is that they are doing the things that the robots cannot yet do. And primarily that involves things that involve dexterity, hand-eye coordination, visual perception. In other words, the ability to reach into a shelf and grab an item, which could be any size and shape and weight and texture and so forth. This is something that up until now, robots have not been able to do, certainly not with the kind of proficiency that a human being can do it. But that is something that is rapidly changing. And what you see on this slide are two robots from a company called Vicarius in Silicon Valley that is building machines that are beginning to take on the kind of visual perception, dexterity, ability to grasp and so forth, manipulate the environment that human beings have. And this is a technology that's clearly getting better and better. There are major investments going into this. Jeff Bezos is actually one of the investors in this particular company. And he said at a conference just a couple of years ago that he thought within about 10 years, robots would reach the point where they would equal human dexterity in terms of their ability to grasp and manipulate objects. And what that means is that within about a decade, it seems almost certain that those Amazon warehouses are going to become a lot less labor intensive. A lot of those jobs are going to evaporate because the robots are going to be able to do most of the tasks that the workers are now doing. So this is something that's going to have a dramatic impact in employment over, roughly the next decade. And of course, it's not just going to be Amazon warehouses. It's going to be factories. It's going to be fast food restaurants, commercial settings, supermarkets and so forth. You're beginning to see these much more dexterous and powerful robots that will appear all over the place. And this is going to have a dramatic impact on the kinds of jobs that are available going forward. But of course, this story is by no means going to be limited to just robots doing manipulative or what we think of as blue collar type work. There's also going to be a dramatic impact on white collar work. If you've got the kind of job where you're sitting in front of a computer, manipulating information in some relatively routine way, that in many ways is going to be even more susceptible to automation than many blue collar jobs would be. And the reason is that white collar jobs that are predictable and repetitive and relatively routine in nature are even easier to automate than blue collar jobs are, because of course you don't need an expensive mechanical robot and machine vision cameras to have visual perception and so forth. It's really just software, machine learning, and the ability to automate these tasks. And you're already beginning to see that happening in areas like law, for example, where you've got smart algorithms that can evaluate documents to see if they're relevant to a legal case, that can, for example, analyze contracts, that can do rudimentary legal research and write briefs and so forth. You're seeing it in the field of journalism, where you've already got smart systems that can look at some stream of data, figure out what is the interesting story within that data, and then automatically generate a new story. And these are technologies that are getting better and better. So we are probably approaching a future where any kind of work that involves sitting in front of a computer, doing the same kind of thing again, whether it's writing a report or doing the same kind of quantitative analysis, or the same kind of presentation and so forth. All of this is going to be highly susceptible to automation. And this is going to have a very significant impact on jobs that are done by people that have high degrees of education, college degrees, maybe even graduate degrees. So again, this is definitely a big paradigm shift and a big disruption that is coming that we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with, I think, going forward. Beyond the potential impact on employment, there are many, many other risks that come along with artificial intelligence. There are many ethical issues that we're going to face. I probably don't have time to go through all of these in detail. We can talk more maybe during the discussion, but just to give one example, the advent of deepfakes, or these are essentially deep learning systems that are used to create fabrications, very high fidelity fabrications of media. It could be photographs, video, audio, that I think are going to be incredibly disruptive. In Rule of the Robots, in the chapter I deal with this, I give an example, a fictional example of a future presidential candidate where some nefarious character creates a deep fake of this person, saying something really horrible, perhaps something, overtly racist, something like that. And you can imagine this audio clip appearing just a few days before the election, and it would be very, very high quality. It would sound exactly like this candidate speaking. And maybe you could bring in experts to analyze this, and eventually they would come to the conclusion that, in fact, this is a fake. It's not real audio. But that might take a while. It might, if it happened only a few days before an election, it could create, chaos. It could actually impact the outcome of an election. And I mean, if you doubt this, in fact, deepfakes have already been used to steal millions of dollars from companies by creating audio tracks of the CEO of the company, asking someone in the finance department to transfer money to some numbered account. And what they've done is they have actually, set up a phone call where they leave a voicemail that's fabricated during this. And they've actually succeeded in tricking companies into transferring money. So this is one thing that's going to be incredibly disruptive. Of course, many of you heard about the potential for algorithmic bias, where, for example, you've got AI systems used in very high stakes scenarios, evaluating resumes to decide if someone should be brought in for an interview. Even in the criminal justice system, algorithms used by judges to decide if someone should be released on bail, for example. And we've seen cases where these algorithms have been biased on the basis of race or gender. So these are very, very important, critical issues that the industry is very much aware of. They raise real dangers, as well as, real ethical concerns. And this is something that, we're all going to have to be very open-eyed about as we embrace artificial intelligence going forward. But finally, what I want to just leave you with is the thought that although the risks, the dangers that come with AI are very real and something that we're going to have to be prepared to address, I think that the potential benefits from the technology overwhelmingly outweigh the risks. In fact, I think that we simply cannot afford to leave artificial intelligence on the table. We can't afford to turn away from it, because I think it's going to be indispensable to us in terms of driving innovation and helping us to solve the problems that we're going to face in the future. And I gave, in some depth, I talked about AlphaFolds being one very good example of that. But that's just one example. I think this is, in a systemic way, going to really drive innovation and creativity in many fields of endeavor, in science and medicine in particular. And that's going to be of critical importance if we want to solve problems like climate change, for example. In order to address climate change, in order to come up with clean energy sources and so forth that can help us solve this problem, we need innovation across the board in many, many different arenas. And I think artificial intelligence is going to be one of the primary tools that makes that happen. So it's absolutely a technology that I think is going to be of vast importance, maybe our most important tool in terms of increased innovation and progress in the future. So what we need to do is absolutely embrace it and leverage it on behalf of everyone, but to do that while being very much aware of the dangers and the risks that comes coupled with it. So I will end there, and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for such an you really covered the terrain extremely well, because I think you gave us a good lay of the land. Perhaps you can stop sharing your slides so we can see each other. So folks in the audience, I'm just going to ask Martin a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to you. And we already have a bunch of open questions, so I'll get to you in just a few minutes. But first of all, thank you, Martin. That was, like I said, really sort of an interesting talk where you laid out both the potential and the risks of AI technology and how powerful it is. For me, one of the things that jumped out was actually the sort of the difference between the AlphaFold example and the robotics examples in the warehouses, because one demands a huge level of cognitive skills and others are more about dexterity, and yet they still come back to the same sort of machine learning technology. But I want to start first with the impact on know-how, because you said this, but I want to sort of make sure we make this point. The CASP competition, the protein folding problem, has been around for 50 years. And here comes an upstart company that's been around has been competing in two competitions, 2 years apart. And this is a field where the best researchers in the world from academia, from industry have worked on this problem, and they weren't able to crack it. And here comes DeepMind and is able to do it. And so this is really sophisticated know-how that they're developing, that people have been working on. So when I think about that, all I can think about is, to your point about global warming or environmental concerns, there's so many complex domains out there where we could use these technologies to sort of develop new knowledge that will make the world better off. So your thoughts on other domains where deep learning has a big role to play?
Well, I think every area of science and medicine is going to be, enormously important. I mean, AlphaFold is just one example, but already there are, I think, a dozen or more startup companies that are using deep learning in drug discovery.
Yes.
In other words, discovering new drugs. So it's going to be extraordinarily powerful. I mean, the way drugs were discovered previously is a very laborious trial and error process, right? Where scientists would have to try different compounds and perform experiments, all of which take time, and they might be able to try, at most a dozen at a time or something.
Right.
But now you've got these deep learning based systems that will go through thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, millions of different chemical compounds, examining the potential interactions with proteins in our bodies and discover the ones that are likely to be most productive. And it's not just about drug discovery, it's general materials. You're seeing the same kind of process in material science, like, in other words, to discover new materials that might be used in better batteries, or new materials that could be used in stronger construction materials and so forth. So across really science and technology, this is just going to become, I think, an enormously important tool and resource.
No, I would agree with that. I spoke to the chief digital officer at Moderna, one of the manufacturers of the mRNA vaccines, and he was sharing with me stories of how they're using machine learning and quality control in the production of these vaccines, something I have to confess I hadn't given much thought to. I want to take you back to where you started, though, and you talked a little bit about, and I love by the way, everybody, this is going to be a short overview of the depth of Martin's book, so I urge you to read the book. There's so much more there, but let's try and do our best. Use this metaphor of electricity of intelligence, and you talk about, one of the beauties of it is that it's scalable, but it's also disruptive. But the one thing I was thinking about is, so you've got these generic tools that are getting more and more powerful. There's computing improvement that you pointed to. There's clearly algorithmic improvement that is important. And then, of course, companies are generating, huge amounts of data. But what's the role of domain expertise in this? Because, you can use Azure machine learning, as I do in my class, with a variety of different problems. But how do you take these democratized tools and apply them to all of these different domains? What does the company need to do, and what does the company need to be good at to sort of launch and scale their own innovations?
Well, I think clearly, companies should be building AI expertise, but it is true. I think that as the tools get better, it won't be so important to employ people that have got PhDs in computer science, because the tools are going to get easier and easier to use, and that means that the what you call the domain expertise is maybe going to shift a bit. It's going to it's going to become less important to understand the absolute rudimentary details of artificial intelligence, and much more important to understand the domain where you want to apply it, and especially the kind of data that's available in that domain, and then be able to use these tools in a very practical way. So I think it's going to shift the expertise away from the nuts and bolts of AI toward an understanding of the particular areas. And of course, that will be different for each company. And in a healthcare company, it will be really important to understand the kind of data that company has, so that you can leverage the tools to get the most important benefit and so forth.
Yeah, the other big story of today was, GM's division Cruise launched its first publicly available. It's been available to employees for the last month, give or take. And as of today, if you're friends and family of employees, you can get, they're not allowed to charge for it, by the way. So if you're up in San Francisco, find a connection and get a free ride on a GM Cruise, in a GM Cruise robotaxi. But there was a lot of videos doing the rounds on the YouTube today. And what it was interesting was, within 30 seconds to a minute, everybody says this is a ho-hum experience, which is sort of what you want in your self-driving car. But that's another application of deep learning. So, a few years ago, we were not sure when this technology was going to be ready for prime time. I'm not sure it's ready for prime time, but it's certainly ready for something right before prime time. How do you see sort of the race to self-driving cars between the GMs, the Teslas, the Cruise? GM is Cruise, of course. All the competitors who are in this space, Waymo, for example, Alphabet's division.
Right. I mean, self-driving cars are really a fascinating area, and it's one area where we have to say, in all honesty, that AI has underperformed what the early expectations were. I mean, but way back in 2015, when I wrote Rise of the Robots, people were saying it was just going to be, a couple years before we had full self-driving cars. And I think what we found is that driving a car in unpredictable circumstances on a public road is an extraordinarily difficult task. And I think that in many ways, it really requires something much closer to human level intelligence than what we might have thought initially. It's really not just a rote, repetitive, routine thing because of the level of unpredictability. So I do think that if you're really imagining a full self-driving car that is going to do everything that an Uber can do, literally can pick you up anywhere and take you anywhere, right? I still think that's quite a ways off. I think that you're going to see these very confined experiments, like the most famous one is Waymo in Arizona, where it's a suburb of Phoenix where the roads are very straight and wide and there aren't a lot of pedestrians and so forth, and it's working. But to go from that to just anywhere is going to be a long haul. But the two approaches that are really fascinating are what companies like Waymo doing, which is a very cautious, incremental approach focused on building systems that are level 4 self-driving systems. And then in contrast to that, what Tesla has been doing, which is just putting cars on the road with what is currently a level 2 system, in other words, an assistive system, and then promising people who pay a lot of money, I think it's something like $10,000
right now, yes,
now, that at some point in the future, they were actually going to be able to download and upload, and their level 2 system is going to become a level 4 system. And that is an extraordinarily ambitious promise. I think that probably Elon Musk deserves a fair amount of criticism for promising that to his customers, because I think that coming with that is a fair amount of risk. What Tesla is doing is literally having its customers beta test, unproven software that it has at least labeled or branded full self-driving, when it clearly is not yet. And that really is something that can put, I think, lives at risk. So it's a very, very ambitious, I think, pushing the very edge of what you could even say is ethically acceptable, I would say. But it is also a remarkable effort to do that. And one thing I would say is that between these two approaches, Tesla does have one very critical advantage, and that is that they have got hundreds of thousands of real cars being driven on roads, and they've got this self-driving system, which is often enabled, and all of these cars are equipped with cameras, and that produces just enormous amounts of data, which Tesla then has access to. So Tesla has access to vastly more real world data coming from real cars on the road than Waymo does. And in the field of artificial intelligence, access to real data is incredibly important. So this is, definitely a competitive advantage that they have, and we'll have to see in the race between these two approaches, who ultimately gets there first.
It's sort of really interesting because even though we talk about AI as a thing, which it sort of is, it's a technology and it applies to self-driving. I think what I would like to leave the audience with is there's still many choices that managers and executives need to make. So the example that you just gave, do you want to start with level 2 and work your way up to level 4 and 5, or do you want to start at level 5 because you believe that every time a computer passes control to a human, you're asking for trouble, which is sort of, I certainly hold that concern because there's a lot of research that supports in human-computer interaction where pilots of ships, for example, have failed because the computer flashes a warning at them and they're not sure what to do in real time. Let me turn it over to the audience, and I'm going to read out the questions to you. So there's several questions, one from Jan van Hammersveld. Jan, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. But the question is, you've got, and we know this, there's a lot of complex models with predictions that are out there. Are there projects in process to examine training models and explaining them? So this is the whole question about explainable AI. In certain areas, it's certainly far more important than others. What do you see happening as this sort of the state of practice today?
Right. This is definitely a very important area. And the problem here, just to summarize it, is that neural networks are to a certain extent like black boxes. I mean, it's like, you literally have something that at a very rudimentary level is simulating the way the neurons in your brain work. And we don't, of course, understand how the brain works. And in a similar way, we don't fully understand what's happening in these artificial neural networks. It's really a distributed kind of learning. But there is a lot of initiative being put into making these networks more transparent and explainable. And in some areas, in some applications, that's important, and others it might not be. If you are, if you're using a neural network to optimize the operation of an industrial machine, then you don't really care, right? About what's happening. You just want the optimal answer. But when you are utilizing a neural network to give a criminal judge a recommendation about whether someone should be put in jail right away or whether they should be released, it's critically important to understand exactly how is that decision arrived at, what are the parameters, and in particular, are we doing this in a way that is not biased racially or based on gender or something. And same thing when you're using AI to screen resumes. We need to understand exactly what's happening there. Are we being fair? Are we being, is it a just outcome? And so, all of the AI companies, the researchers are very much aware of this, and there are a lot of initiatives right now into making these systems more transparent, and also into the related area of AI fairness. How do you build systems that in fact are not biased? So it's what I would say is that the people working in the field are very much in tune with this and are putting a lot of effort into solving these problems, although it's not always easy.
Here's a lighthearted question for the day after all this heavy topics we've been covering. Are there some fun and free ways to experiment with this technology?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Are there some fun and free ways to experiment with this technology?
Well, yeah, you can download. I talked about deepfakes, for example. You can get software to make your own deepfakes, and if you go online, you can see some kind of joke applications of these. There's a very famous one where you've got President Barack Obama saying, things that he certainly wouldn't say. You can find deepfakes of Mark Zuckerberg saying things that he might be thinking, but would certainly never say. So you can have a lot of fun with that. And of course, AI is being incorporated increasingly into video games. It's, actually sophisticated video games are one of the hotspots where you're really, beginning to see AI applied, where you've got, characters in games that rather than human players are AI-based players and so forth. So there's lots of areas where you can experiment with this, either with actually developing it or or utilizing it.
Yeah, there's plenty of cloud solutions that I'm not sure that they're free or not, but they're relatively inexpensive if you want, from Amazon, Microsoft, whomever. There's plenty of those too. There's an interesting question again from Jan, which is, I'm going to try and shorten it. A lot of the change, from Jan's perspective, a lot of the sort of applications of technology around self-driving trucks, robotics, fry cooks, whatever, are really going to hit the low end of the market, the low end of the lowest wage end of the market, of the labor market pretty hard. Based on these threats, what can we do as technologists, and I'm quoting, to ensure the weavers don't burn the looms? As technologists, it seems we have a responsibility to focus on assistive and augmenting technology when addressing low-wage jobs. What do you, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, eventually I think this could all reach the point where we need to really take a hard look at the nature of our social contract and really, revise that. That was the main theme of my earlier book, Rise of the Robots, where I really looked at this. And my proposal in that book, which I still essentially believe, is that someday we'll need something along the lines of a universal basic income. We'll probably have to supplement incomes for most or maybe all, people. And again, it's not just going to be the low end blue collar workers. I mean, this is, as I pointed out, is going to absolutely have an impact on white collar work as well.
Yeah.
And I think you can argue that it may well already have an impact at the entry level, at the more routine, repetitive types of white collar work that recent college graduates, for example, are likely to take. And that's one of the reasons that if you look at college graduates over the last few years, a lot of them end up in positions that don't really require a college degree, right? They're working at Starbucks or something similar. So this is a very real problem for us. And I think that, absolutely we need to invest in training. I think community colleges, so people can, transition into areas that are less impacted by automation. In other words, things that are less routine and repetitive, more creative, harder to automate, maybe involving relationship building with people and so forth. These are the areas that are probably relatively safe, but eventually it may be such a big problem that we need to do something more dramatic, I think.
There's a question from Erin Thomas, which is exactly on the lines you were talking about. I would think we will still need people to manage the robots. What sorts of skills and academic programs should young people consider to prepare for that?
Well, in terms of if you're in a university, I think the main things I would emphasize are, number one, creativity, and try to enter a field where you're doing something, thinking outside the box, building something new, right? Because if you're a scientist and you're working in biomedicine, then a tool like AlphaFold, for example, is not going to replace you. Rather, it's going to enormously enhance your ability to innovate, right? So it's going to complement you. The people really at risk, so those people sitting in front of a computer doing the same things again and again. So you don't want to prepare yourself for that. So creativity is one area. Another area is the kinds of jobs where you're really building sophisticated relationships with other people. Think of a nurse where you're working with patients and you have to have a high degree of empathy, or a business consultant where you really have to have a deep understanding of a client in order to solve those problems. So I think it'll be a long time before machines can really, build meaningful relationships with people. I mean, you do see rudimentary progress in that area. There are already, for example, chatbots that do very basic mental health counseling, help people with depression and so forth. And this is, a positive development. But I think if you're building really complex relationships, that's going to be a relatively safe area for
though I do have to say that there were people actually working on their dissertation in the protein folding area that had to find a new thesis topic after DeepMind solved some of the things they were working on. So they actually had to shift their entire research trajectory, which could be a good couple of years wasted. But I think the broader point I would completely agree with 100%. What work is being done to use? So this is sort of the two sides using AI. So AI is being used to create deep fakes. And the question from Don McCrae is, what work is using AI to detect and combat deepfakes?
Right. There are, I mean, this is it's a very challenging problem. The guy that actually invented what are called adversarial generative networks, which are what are used generally to create deepfakes, his name is Ian Goodfellow. And you know, he has said that he thinks that probably there may not really be a technological solution to this problem, that eventually we may have to accept the fact that the things we see, the media we see, it may not actually be possible to determine whether it's real or whether it's fabricated. And that obviously that's a whole can of worms. I mean, imagine the implications of that for the legal system, where a jury might be presented with a video and you cannot say categorically, is it real or is it not? You know, so that's a real problem. And there are initiatives underway, things like you know, digital watermarks.
Yeah.
There's one company that is doing this with photographs already that are used by the insurance industry. So suppose you want to insure some jewelry or something, one thing you might do is take a photograph of it, right? And then you would send it to this company and take out a policy to insure, you know, whatever you took a photo of. But of course, the company has to be sure that that's a real photograph and that this thing actually exists, right? So this is already happening. But the bottom line is that, you know, there simply may not be a real solution. And at a minimum, there will always be kind of an arms race between the people using this technology for nefarious purposes and the people that are trying to build tools to defend, right? Very much like what we see with computer viruses, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the future we're looking at.
And folks, if you haven't looked at a deepfake, you rolled in, I mean, don't overdo this, but you should do some of it, because I was presented with the deepfake actually by a good friend of mine who's a professor at MIT. He actually spoke at one of these events in Naral, and they used the technologies to completely, he gave an entire speech on one of those other people money type investment deals where they used his presence and they got his lips moving perfectly in sync with his words. The accent was completely wrong, but you had to know him to know that that wasn't his accent. But it was completely convincing, and he was selling, like I said, a scammy investment, and apparently people gave money. And he was desperately trying to alert folks. So it is very, very real, at least at a superficial level. I can see how people can get fooled by it.
Right, and the thing is, it's going to get a lot better than it is now. I mean, what we see right now is very rudimentary, but you know, the quality of these fabrications is going to get a lot better.
I think at some point it's going to be my avatar versus your avatar, I guess, is where we're going to end up with this. In a provocative question from Justin Early. Over the past few years, some thinkers have concluded AI is good for things that require mere competence doing tasks, but you need humans for things that require comprehension, like synthesis, ethics, and so on. Do you think that distinction will hold for the next 10 or so years?
For the next 10 or so years, I would say yes, because you know, in order to genuinely replace all the qualities that human beings bring to the table, you would need human level artificial intelligence, right?
Right.
And that is something I believe will happen. I mean, in fact, you know, as I said, I interviewed many of the top people in the field, and virtually all of them believe that someday we will have machines that match and very likely exceed human intelligence. And that would include the ability to think in all the ways that human beings think. But very few people think it's only 10 years away. I mean, there are some that are actually that aggressive. Ray Kurzweil, for example, thinks that. But I would not agree with it. I suspect this is probably a 50-year problem, something on that order, and many people think it could be even, you know, 100 years or more. But sort of for the foreseeable future, yes, there absolutely is going to be a role for people to bring the kind of holistic general purpose thinking that machines are not capable of, as well as ethical insights and so forth, for sure.
I'm going to combine two questions by Jody Giles and Sam King. One is, can you comment on the aspect of understanding algorithmic bias and how to build trust in AI? That's from Sam. And Jody's question is, what regulatory initiatives are we seeing towards the AI risks you listed? So how do we address the challenges of risk through building trust as well as through regulation? Because you probably need both.
Right. As I said, there are many initiatives underway at companies like Google and Facebook and IBM are all making very significant investments in ways to counteract algorithmic bias. So one approach that is being taken that I think is very, very promising is the use of counterfactuals, where anytime you apply one of these algorithms, what you do is you swap important parameters, things like race or gender and so forth, and you essentially reapply the analysis and you make sure that you come to the same outcome. So you're making sure that you're not leveraging this sensitive parameter in a way that makes a difference. So that's one approach being taken, and there's a lot of work being done on this, and I think that we will get better at it. But it's not necessarily an easy problem. It's actually can be quite difficult. In terms of regulation, I think that that's something that for the most part still lies in the future. What we see with artificial intelligence is that some applications intersect with regulatory apparatus that is already there. So self-driving cars clearly are going to come under the purview of the Department of Transportation, right? Medical applications of artificial intelligence are going to be regulated by the FDA. So to some extent, that's covered. But when we talk about bias in algorithms used by a company that's screening resumes or something, there is not actually some agency that is empowered to audit those algorithms and make sure that they're not biased. And actually, I think that is something that we probably need in the future. So one of the recommendations I make in Rule of the Robots is that we maybe need a new agency, something like the SEC or the FDA or the Federal Aviation Administration that focuses specifically on the implications of artificial intelligence and especially covers the areas that are not covered by other agencies, because it clearly is critically important that if you're going to use an algorithm to screen resumes, then we want to make sure that's not biased, right? There should be some sort of auditing of algorithms like that to make sure that they are in fact fair. And that's even more true if we're going to apply algorithms in the criminal justice system, for example. So I think that that's something that we're likely to see kind of emerge in the coming years.
So Martin, I have a favor to ask of you. We have so many questions. We usually end right on time. And if you have to go, of course, we will fully understand. But if you can give us 5 or 7 more minutes.
Sure, no, I'm happy to stick around, sure.
Oh, fantastic. So my colleague, Tanya Bradford, has an interesting question. She thanks you for an inspiring talk. So many opportunities for AI and ML, and she loves the analogy about AI as a utility. Appreciate the awareness that the challenges, but raise particularly ones related to equity. And the question is, as we continue to advance AI, how do we address some of the disruptions to talent pipelines? In other words, how do we get not only current workers, but also K through 12 students to begin considering the possibilities for their contributions in the future to the workplace?
Right. I mean, this is a very important concern because artificial intelligence is going to become our most consequential technology in many ways. It's going to impact virtually everything. So, of course, it is important to make sure that the people that have the deepest understanding of the technology, that are involved in developing it and setting the direction for it, I mean, they need to come from, they need to come across society, right? From every community. And again, I think that this is something that has really become an important focus. I mean, virtually every major tech company is making strong initiatives to, bring as many talented people as possible in from marginalized communities, to get more women, more people of color, and so forth. The same is true of universities. Yep. Again, it is not an easy problem because to be an artificial intelligence researcher, you need a very strong mathematical background and so forth. You need a very strong interest in this topic, and the pipeline of individuals, is not that strong. So a lot of this involves initiatives, much earlier, right? And earlier in education in schools and stuff. And actually in Rule of the Robots, I talk about one very important initiative, which is undertaken by Fei Li, who is a professor at Stanford and is one of the main people who's really one of the most important minds in artificial intelligence. But she's got a specific program designed to bring young girls and people from underrepresented backgrounds at the high school level and get them involved in this, for example. So there are a lot of programs like that out there. So I do think that in the future, certainly the people working in AI are certainly going to become more diverse than they are now, but it remains, an important challenge.
Now, in fact, at the center, we were going to do a similar thing for homeless children in Orange County, which there are a surprising number of. Unfortunately, the pandemic interfered. My student, Marlo Stone, we sort of touched on this. How far away do you think self-driving cars are? And is a national 6G network a must for level 5 cars to be on the road?
Well, I think certainly the 5G technology is critical in terms of the increased bandwidth and everything, and that will be an enabler not just of self-driving cars, but of basically intelligence that's distributed everywhere, right, in all kinds of machines and places and so forth. But really, the real problem with self-driving cars continues to be the AI, the ability to solve problems and to deal with unpredictable scenarios. And I think, again, if you're really looking at that vision of a self-driving car that can literally be an automated Uber, where the car comes, you can get in it, you can tell it to go anywhere you want. I think that's probably at least 10 years away, that would be my guess. But certainly before then, we're going to have more restricted use cases.
And even there's options like, you're getting the Ubers and the Lyfts with their own self-driving fleets, in which case they become like Hertz and Avis. Or you've got Tesla, which apparently is considering you and me, if we own Teslas, being able to rent out our Teslas because they are self-driving or will be fully self-driving at some point in the future. So it's an interesting business model question. John Mooney has a question. It begins by thanking you and all your work in this area. What are your views on the readiness of US businesses and leaders in particular to effectively adopt AI and realize its business value?
Well, there have been some surveys done by some of the consulting firms. I worked a little bit with Deloitte on this. And, I think there is overwhelming awareness among, like the C-level executives about the importance of this technology. And the importance of investing in it. There's also widespread, I think, to some extent, concern about the potential impact on jobs and the ethical issues that are going to arise. So I do think that most executives, at least in larger organizations, are very much aware of this. I mean, obviously, different companies are having different outcomes in terms of their success in adapting to this. So I think it's going to be kind of a noisy, messy situation, but clearly we are moving forward aggressively. I think the United States is relatively well positioned in terms of, relative to other countries in terms of being at the forefront of this. But again, the message here is that AI is becoming like electricity, and you certainly would not run a business and disconnect from the electrical grid, right? That would be the highest level of business malpractice to do that. And the same is going to be true of AI. So clearly, we're going to move forward, and certainly those companies that are first movers are going to have a very important advantage.
For those who've seen Downton Abbey, there's funny stories about it because electricity comes in and the telephone comes in one of the seasons, and you've got sort of the workers who are willing to embrace telephony and sell telephone systems or install them that in a few short years go on to making a lot of money. But there's also the introduction of electricity, and they're actually worried about being electrocuted. And these are supposedly real life examples that they've woven into the stories. I want to switch to a question from Don Benkes, I think how you pronounce last name. How do you see boards of directors engaging with management on AI and providing oversight? Because there's the executive decisions, but boards have sort of these governance responsibilities, right?
Right. That's not an issue I've thought a lot about, but I guess it's a general governance issue. I mean, the board of directors, as well as the top management, is going to have to come to understand that this is going to be, AI is going to be, I think, such a critically important resource to many large companies in the future that you almost have to view it on the level of human resources, right? I mean, everyone understands that the people in the company are a critical resource the source of the success of the company. We invest enormous resources in the HR department in developing people to maximize that resource. But AI is going to become sort of a rising second resource that's going to have to be viewed in a somewhat similar way, in the sense that it's going to require enormous investment of talent and resources in order to maximize the application of that resource. In other words, to make that business competitive. Because if the board and the executive team fail to do that, that company is going to be destined to fall behind the competition.
Yeah, I really see it as a dichotomy here because, I was at a meeting of technology executives last week, and, you hear all of these stories about self-driving and the big companies investing very heavily. And then you talk to mid-cap companies, for example, and they're nowhere close to sort of launching AI applications. Some, I should say, not, there's certainly some out there that are doing it, but so there is sort of, I think, a real challenge in front of us. The talent is a huge set of issues, but I think even working with cloud solutions like the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Googles make available requires a level of competence that I think we at universities need to work on providing to the companies that employ our students. I'm going to close, we've kept you long enough, so I don't want to hold you here forever. You've been very generous with your time, but I want to ask you one last question, sort of fun. So we've talked about all the work impacts. I want to switch, there's a lot of questions here, so I'm grouping them on sort of the creative aspects of it. So what happens to music composers, artists? And then there was a separate set of questions on, does AI have any, can it sort of infer taste and smell and things like that? So things that are not things that business folks usually, of course we do it as individuals, as humans, but not necessarily as part of a job unless you're a perfumist or something like that.
Right. So the impact on what we would think of as creative, uniquely human endeavors is something that, kind of remains to be seen. There already are AI systems that can write symphonies. Mm-hmm. There are AI systems that can do original paintings, works of art. And you can, if you can look at one of these works or listen to it and, not be told that it was created by a machine and not a human being, and in some cases react to it, have an emotional reaction to it, connect with it, perhaps be moved by it. So, there's a basic question does that constitute art? Is art something that by definition can only be created by a human being? Or if art is created by a machine, but it connects with a human being and moves you in some way, has an influence on you, then is that legitimate, right? So there are real questions there. My feeling is that for the foreseeable future, although there is certainly a lot of research and innovation in the area of creative machines, that if artificial intelligence is going to be a complement to human creativity, it's going to be something that amplifies creativity. And already, in fact, you see visual artists working, with the kind of technology used in deepfakes to rather than creating fake things, to create new things, new forms of art and so forth. So I think it will actually amplify our creativity, but there definitely is kind of a blurry line between what is human and what is machine, and that may have real implications for the future. I think it's going to be a fascinating journey there. Yeah, and absolutely, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And the other question about smell and taste and things, that that's a question of building sensors that can do this, and there absolutely are initiatives in that area, specifically in things of detecting drugs, or doing, we don't have anything that is as good as a dog, right? In terms of detecting, smell and so forth, but there are initiatives in that way. Not just vision, but smell, touch, all of that is going to be very important to the future of robotics. So it's not just about AI per se, it's also about the sensors and how they can be tied into neural networks that can interpret that data and in many cases create real human sensation. So absolutely lots of progress there.
Let me bring it back up to a high level. Let me close with this, because I love the last few pages of your book where you talk about sort of what happens in the future, that you're a cautious optimist, my phrase, not yours. So obviously there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of peril. What do we have to do, just a few things that sort of increase the probability that we will achieve more of the promise and less of the peril? Are there any obvious steps that we as responsible executives or academics should be doing in our companies or teaching our students?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to, first of all, address the risks that come with AI. When we've talked a lot about, the potential for bias and the potential for increased economic inequality as jobs are automated. If we can, that's the one that I probably worry about more than anything. We really need to find solutions to that, and it may involve coming up with a new social contract. If we don't, we're going to, I think by default, if we just do nothing, end up in a world that is even more unequal than it is already. And we already know that inequality is a problem, right? It's going to get even worse and worse. And, in those last few pages of the book that you referred to, I talk about two potential outcomes. The most optimistic scenario is something like Star Trek, right? Where you've got this world of abundance, where technology solves our problems, where human beings are released from the need to have a job that's just drudgery, where they walk all day at some mundane task in order to earn an income and survive. People in Star Trek don't have to do that, right? They're living in a universe of material abundance, and they're doing things that excite them. So that's the most optimistic path that I hope we can come as close to as possible. But a much more pessimistic take, I say in the book, is something a bit more like the Matrix movie, right? Where not that machines would enslave us, but rather that maybe the real world becomes so unequal. People feel that in the real world, they have so little chance to really get ahead and to thrive, that instead they begin to escape into this virtual world where, we see this combination of virtual reality and artificial intelligence creating an alternative where you can just plug in, essentially, sit at home and have some virtual vicarious experience without engaging in the real world, and essentially check out. And you might see more and more people kind of fall into that, whether it's virtual reality or maybe it's other things like drug addiction, where you simply are divorced from the real world. And I think that's extraordinarily dystopian. So if we want to get closer to that Star Trek scenario where people remain engaged in the real world and they're thriving and seeing opportunity and seeing a meaningful existence, whether they're working in traditional jobs or not, we've got to do a lot of thinking about how to adapt to these changes and how to really leverage this technology in positive ways on behalf of everyone, instead of ending up in a world where AI is positive for a very small number of wealthy people and everyone else kind of gets left behind.
Well, thank you so much, Martin. We've been talking with Martin Ford, the author of Rise of the Robots. I hope you can see the book. I'm sorry, The Rule of the Robots. Rise of the Robots was his previous book. It's an excellent read. Thank you again for sharing your thoughts with us and for the wonderfully engaging conversation that we just had. Really appreciate it. And let me not forget to thank our audience for attending. We really sort of appreciate the support you've shown us over the number of the 10 years coming on that we've been in existence. And finally, I do want to acknowledge our sponsors once again, KPMG and Kalpana Ramakrishnan and the Beal Family Foundation and Don and Ken Beal. Thank you to all of you for attending. Thank you to our sponsors. And most of all, thank you to Martin and my staff for helping us host these events. Good luck with the rest,
Thank you for having me.
the book, and good luck with your next project, whatever it might be. Again, thank you for joining us.